All right. Hi, everybody. In person and on Zoom. A little bit of a new thing, hybrid for me. I'm Judge Rosen from King County Superior Court. Thank you for joining us on our jury diversity webinar discussing the new report coming out from CLE or having come out from CLE, which is an interim report, and what we've been doing for the last 10 years in this process. Through this seminar, or webinar, whatever we call it, please feel free to ask questions. If you have something, please feel free to raise your hand if you're on Zoom or in person, speak up. We want interruptions, we want questions, especially my guess is during the second and third part of the presentation for the professors. There's so much data, you may have questions. Some of it is complicated, some of it raises other questions that the lawyers and legal folks in the process are going to want to ask. So don't be shy. If you have any technical issues, let us know and we'll see if we can help. So we wanted to see if we can thank everybody who was involved in creating this report, including Professor Collins, who's here and will be presenting in a minute, Professor Gialopsos, who is not here but will be presenting virtually, and Bailey Tanaka, who is with CLU and has been a big part of our process. We have Frank Thomas present in person live, and Cynthia Delostrinos, who have been invaluable partners from AOC, the Administrative Office of the Court, getting this put together today and also in getting everything done that needs to get done over the past 10 years and hopefully the next 10 years. We wanted to say special thanks to Chris Gaddis, who is present here, for all of his help over maybe the last 5 to 7 years. Pierce County has been a real ally in getting data that we need to make good reports, good information gathering, and their technology is second to none. It's not just second to none, it's probably 10 years ahead of everybody else and is much, much better. Unique Mailer from Edmonds Municipal Court has been a part of our work group and has contributed, as has Aaron McCauley, who was formerly at CLU and has now moved on. So we thank them, as well as the Washington State Legislature, the Administrative Office of the Courts, the Minority and Justice Commission, and specifically Representatives Bergquist and Hackney for their support, their pushing this issue, their funding of it, and getting it front and center, which we will be talking about more as we move through the slides. We're going to have 3 parts to the presentation. Part 1 is context and importance, which is my part. What has happened in the past? How are we? What do we have to do to get to where we are today? And what is some of the law that affects jury diversity decisions? Part 2 is the background of research. And Professor Gialopsos will go through that and tell you sort of how the process went in this study and some of the findings from it. And then Professor Collins will take part 3 and give you the data that I think everybody wants to see. So part 1, how did we get here? This process started a long time ago, a decade ago, in 2013, where I sent out a letter to all the minority bar associations, prosecutors, public defenders, ACLU, et cetera, and said, hey, I'm seeing a problem with our jury panels. Let's talk about it. That turned into sort of a work group or task force. When we decided to look into the issue, we learned how summonsing works, how the source lists work. We talked to the Secretary of State. We talked to the Department of Licensing. These were, a long time ago. We went down to Olympia and met with people. We talked to the Washington Department, WATEC it's called, or at least it used to be called WATEC, that dealt with all of the names coming through on source lists and all the private juror companies and almost every jury administrator in Washington to learn how things worked. And we came up with a short report that suggested that we continue as a state to monitor juror demographics and to study the issue, which resulted in the first study, which was funded by the Minority and Justice Commission, which I would be remiss if I did not thank. Over the past 10 years, we would not be where we were today if we did not have their support and their funding. They've been integral to this process. This was a study that Cynthia Delostrinos and I recreated the wheel, or maybe created the wheel for. Duct tape and baling wire, as one of our judges likes to say. There was no precedent for how to do this, so we made it up. I typed up the survey, we figured out how Scantrons worked, we mailed paper all around the state, and we did the survey. Later on, CLE was brought on, was Professor Collins at the time by himself to help us with the analysis once the data started flowing through. And we had a number of partners around the state. I forget, but around 25 courts that participated for almost a full year in getting data. And it was a big process. And it was successful. We learned a lot. And Professor Collins is going to talk more about it. We then presented those results to the Supreme Court in a symposium, which of course resulted in them forming another work group, or this was really called the task force that we put together. We worked together for a year, and this was everybody. We had a huge conference table, every entity, federal courts, state courts, local courts, prosecutors, public defenders, private bar, jury administrators, whoever you could think of was at the table. And we generated a report which had 6 recommendations that we felt were high priority, 13 ideas that were considered that were not recommended, and 2 ideas that were very promising, but we needed more information about. Since that time, which was task force report was generated in 2017 or 2018, I believe, there were, again, 6 recommendations and 2 promising ideas. We've now had 5 of those have been implemented in Washington or are currently being proposed in the state legislature. We've had a change to Washington law on what happens to felons and whether they're allowed to serve as jurors. We have a proposal on juror pay. We've looked at childcare. We have more resources. We have had studies funded. These things have been slowly coming to fruition. So that was nice to realize as I put this together, and we are making progress, albeit very slow progress. The 2021 study that we did, which was after that first study, this was in the pandemic. We said, well, we have a change. Let's see what's going on. And we decided that we needed to try different ways of conducting the survey so that we could expand it and make it inexpensive and get better results. We went back to the drawing board and we tried to figure out how to do this. In some courts, in Pierce County, for example, they put up QR codes and asked jurors to scan them to take a survey. In King County, we tried having jurors go through it as part of the registration process. They did some paper surveys in Snohomish County. Without Pierce, King, and Snohomish, we never would have figured out that what we were doing wasn't working that well. We got a fairly low response rate. We did get some data that was fairly reasonable, but we also, as part of that, figured out how to do things to get good response rate, which resulted in the 2022 survey, which is what Professor Collins and Gialopsos are going to tell you about. We fixed that response rate problem. We had a very, very high response rate to the 2022 study, 85 to 90%. And it's considered, as Professor Collins will tell you, very reliable, more than statistically significant, and probably something that you could rely on in making decisions if you're a policymaker. The next section of the slides is on importance. Why does any of this matter? Why are we doing this? Why are we here today? Why do we care? Without participation from all members of our society, all different sections, we don't have legitimacy. People can rightly criticize. It's a bunch of white men making decisions. There's no trust in our system. It's also just basically fair. We need to have a system that includes everybody so that we feel like we're represented. This is a democracy after all. Also, many studies have shown that jurors that are diverse, even if there's a diverse person, say one minority on a jury, a veneer, a panel that's not selected, that affects the ultimate outcome and the decision making when the trial happens. So this is incredibly important for decision making. And we can't forget that under Washington law, jurors have a right to serve. They can't be discriminated against. State versus Hilliard is one of the main cases in Washington from 1977 that dealt with this. And I want to just go through the law briefly. I'm sure many of you know a lot of this, but I want to make a little bit of a refresher. So we have this says a criminal defendant, which is true, but one would argue that any litigant has the right to be tried by a jury that is representative of the community. The defendant bears a burden of proof to show that the list is not representative, excluding an identifiable population group. So that is, the defendant has to say there aren't enough Blacks, Asians, men, women, whatever on the panel. And there's a 3-part test from Duren versus Missouri. The first part is that the group alleged to be excluded is a distinctive group in the community. This is not always easy, but you can see my parenthetical there. It can be relatively easy to prove. A number of cases that have discussed this, there has even been a stipulation by the parties. An African-American group in our society is a distinctive group. Women are a distinctive group. Those things are generally accepted by litigants in the courts. So that can be easy to show. The second test is that the representation of the group in veneers from which juries are selected is not fair and reasonable in relation to the number of such persons in the community, which is a mouthful. But what it means is that if there are 2 women on the panel of 50 for selection, and the ratio of women to men in the community is 50%, you might posit that that's not reasonable. There are a number of issues that make this very difficult to determine from a legal standpoint, because is the average that there are 50 women on a panel, and this just happens to be an anomaly because they are randomly drawn? Or is that happening in every panel? And how do you prove that? And as you can see, I put in parentheses, there's no established test. There are a number of proposals, and the Supreme Court of the United States has said fairly clearly the court should sort of consider all of the tests and all of the data and try to make a decision in each case. Some say there should be a bright line test, but currently there isn't. And I would posit that you need data to prove this, which is one of the reasons we undertook this project. When you have a jury panel that has 2 African-American members and there's 50 people, is that representative of the community? Unless you know what's in the community and what's happening in all the other jury panels, it's very difficult to prove what's going on. This data might be used to show what's happening in all the other panels, at least in the jurisdictions where the data is gathered. Because when a litigant is in court, they know what's happening in their courtroom, but they don't know what's happening in all the other courtrooms in that jurisdiction. And the third part is that the underrepresentation is due to systemic exclusion. And that can be very, very difficult to prove according to case law. And I want to focus on that for just a minute, because I think it's applicable to what we're talking about today. This systematic exclusion of the group in the jury selection process, as I said, is difficult to prove. And it brings up the question, what does prove systematic exclusion? We don't know. And case law says, you know it when you see it. If it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. There have been cases about, there's one case in particular where women were excluded, I can't remember the details, unless they opted in to the jury process. And then a litigant challenged that and said, well, there's only 10% of the women that should be in my panel. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's a problem. But there's been many, many, many other cases where we don't know what systematic exclusion is, and we don't know how to prove it. So I wonder what could prove this exclusion. If we were to show that women are excluded because they have more dependent care problems, if they are excused for hardship, or they don't answer their summons as often as men, could that qualify? I'm not sure. Do more minorities fail to respond to a summons than whites? Do we know that? Do we know why that happens? Could that be exclusion? Possibly. I'm not sure. What about a high disqualification rate for a group such as Asians based on lack of speaking English? If they're excluded at much higher rates than other groups because of lack of speaking English, perhaps that's something that would affect a court or a legislative decision. Another question is, what about white versus non-whites in terms of wealth or pay? And if you couple that with the current rate of pay for jurors in Washington State, and if data were to suggest that poor jurors are less likely to participate in the process, might that be systematic exclusion? I don't know. And there could be many other reasons. One of the reasons that this slide is up here is because we have a huge data set that is growing every day. You'll hear from Professor Collins that we have well over 100,000 responses that are in response to our demographic survey. And every time someone registers for jury service, that number ticks up one in one of our counties. We've also been collecting a lot of paper, some demographic surveys that we haven't processed yet or that we haven't analyzed yet. And so the numbers are going to go up and up and up. That is a huge database, and we cannot effectively analyze every aspect of it because there are so many aspects. What about the gender identity of jurors in relation to pay and their race and the county that they're in? You could ask that question 100 different ways because we have so many different data points. And so one of the things that we want you to do is feel free to ask us questions now or in the future and say, hey, your reports that you've published so far have not addressed this issue. And I would like to know about Asian American lesbians who make a lot of money in this county. Whatever the question might be, this data can be mined to figure it out. We do have limited resources, so keep that in mind. But if you have questions, send me an email, send Professor Collins, one of the others an email, and see what we can do. So, part 2, background of jury diversity research in Washington State. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Gialopsos. And Professor, when you want me to advance the slide, just let me know. And I'm going to turn on your video here in Portland.
Thank you. Thanks, Judge Rosen, for that. Good morning, everyone. As he mentioned, I am Dr. Brooke Gialopsos. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Criminal Justice, Criminology, and Forensics at Seattle University. And I am going to discuss the 2 prior research studies in a little more detail, and then we'll dive into the current research and interim report. Judge Rosen, please advance. There you go. So the initial study that was done, as he mentioned, was in 2016 to 2017. It spanned roughly 14 months, and it was a real initial exploration of jury demographics in the state. Paper surveys were utilized, and specifically 33 Washington counties were involved, ranged from municipal to superior court levels, and in all, roughly 64,750 surveys were usable. As also mentioned, it was a pretty high response rate of around like 83% for that first study. Next slide, please. And so the big takeaways from that study were that certain demographic groups are underrepresented in jury summons. Specifically, results showed that Black, Native, Indigenous people of color, including Asian Americans and Hispanic Latino Americans, are underrepresented in nearly every Washington jury pool. The findings also indicated that BIPOC women were underrepresented in all courts within the analysis. There were some findings that also pointed to differences by race and sexual orientation that may indicate underrepresentation among racial categories. But the really big important takeaway here was that there were clear patterns across all courts that showed marginalized groups may experience significant hurdles to participating in the jury process. Next slide, please. And then in 2021, the COVID-19 pandemic provided us an opportunity to test out electronic surveys. And so specifically, we were able to embed a survey link to an online survey in the check-in process. And as mentioned, 3 counties in Washington participated in this, King, Pierce, and Snohomish. And it went for about 4 months. And so in addition to, getting a little bit more information and exploring barriers to jury service, in addition to gathering some information on demographics, we were also able to explore barriers to jury service. And that was really, that was really nice as well, because it actually provided us a chance to have some concrete data on what anecdotally we were hearing or seeing. Next slide, please. And so similar to the other study, we did find that certain key groups were still underrepresented, but we also were able to show that there are those significant hurdles that we were speculating. And so specifically, there were 2 categories of barriers that really jumped out. So 82% of the respondents indicated what we called responsibility-related barriers. And so these could be work-related, financial hardships, being in a college or away away for college, personal travel, and military deployment. So all of those collectively created this largest category. And I do want to say that it was possible for individuals to talk about multiple barriers. And so if you were to go back and look at this report, you would see that the numbers exceed 100% because they were able to list as many as they had encountered. And then the other large category were what we called care-related barriers. So about 35.8% of the respondents who said that they had a barrier indicated a care-related barrier. And specifically, most of those were childcare as well as other dependent cares, maybe an aging parent. They also indicated things like family issues, breastfeeding, or homeschooling or COVID-19 induced remote learning. And so all of those constituted this care-related barrier category. Next slide, please. And so what we are going to do now is we're going to kind of pivot to the current research. So those prior studies proved really influential in helping us identify like the types of questions to ask. We were able to modify and improve our questions and make our answer choices more inclusive from the initial study to now. And then also, as just mentioned, the last study was electronic. And so that really allowed us to kind of pilot that modality. And so that's going to be really relevant to the current research study. Next slide, please. And so during the 2020-2021 legislative session, the legislators passed this bill that required Washington Administrative Office of the Courts to provide all courts with an electronic demographic survey for jurors who begin a jury term. And so the aim was to collect data on each juror's race, ethnicity, age, sex, employment status, and educational attainment and income. There was also this caveat about any other data approved by the Chief Justice of Washington State Supreme Court. And that was important to us because through that, we were able to also include sexual orientation in our data collection. So the central, thank you. The central question is, are summoned jurors representative of the counties from which they are selected? Next slide, please. And so here's what we have been doing for the last year and a half. And I apologize if it is small or hard to see. But on the very beginning, you see the passage of the bill that I just mentioned. And then since then, we really had to wrap our head around how we can do this at a much larger level than had been done before. So we spent some time developing the process and, we recruited municipal district and superior courts in a really unique way. We had individual outreach and onboarding meetings with all of them who wanted to participate or expressed interest. And that proved to be really, really important because although the original bill mentioned specifically electronic data collection, we realized very quickly that we had to provide courts with a paper option too. For a lot of reasons, courts just could not do the electronic route. And so we had to pivot. Also on this, and it's important as I'm wearing my professor hat to mention that we did secure all the appropriate IRB, Institutional Review Board protections. We went through the process to make sure that the federal criteria were being upheld and that we were protecting all human subjects. And so where we are right now is where that yellow arrow is. In December, we were able to complete our interim report, which has been shared. And we've in fact been presenting the data for about 4 weeks in a row now, and we're very excited. But in terms of where we still have to go is the final report will be due June 30th, 2023. Next slide, please. Now, as I've indicated, there are 8 demographic questions that we are focusing on. These are the ones that were specifically outlined. Question 1 through 7 were specifically outlined in the bill. And then we used that other data approved by the Chief Justice to include sexual orientation. And I do want to mention that we chose to use gender identity rather than sex, rather than a binary sex, in order to be more inclusive. And both the use of gender identity and sexual orientation is just really consistent with the work of the Gender and Justice Commission, as well as the prior research that we had done. And so I'm excited by the inclusivity of our variables, as well as the answer choices that we provided. Next slide, please. Now, we did do one other thing, and because this was not mandated by the bill, it was purely optional for the courts. But in order to further collect data on that important barrier piece, courts could choose to have the following question. Have you ever experienced any barriers that impact your ability to attend jury service? And so what we did is we took those most common responses from our 2021 report and we made those into sort of multiple choice answers just to kind of streamline the process. A lot of courts were, wanting to make sure that the survey was brief and wouldn't take up too much time because they were concerned that their jurors, their potential jurors would not then, complete the process. And so even though we did outline those answers for them, things like work-related conflicts, financial hardships, dependent care, we also provided an other option that gave them a very large text box to elaborate on anything that we may have missed. Next slide, please. And then per our IRB requirements, individuals had the option to select prefer not to answer for each question. And then also there was an option not to take the survey, but yet still go in and register for jury duty. Next slide, please. And so what you see on this slide is sort of the two different pieces where we're collecting data. So for the electronic survey, which is going to be the focus of the data that's shared with you all today, when jurors are summoned, we are collecting them in that red box, right? Where they go online, they respond for jury duty, they're very seamlessly transferred over to our survey and then back to their jury management system. So that is where we are collecting the electronic surveys. But the paper surveys, which, as I mentioned, we realized a real need for, those are actually capturing a different period of time. So in those cases, someone is summoned for jury duty, they respond by mail or in person. And if they show up in person on that allotted day at that particular time, then they are given the option to complete the paper survey. And so I just wanted to highlight that is the data collection process. And as I've already mentioned, today we will only be focusing on the interim results, which are the top line when folks are responding to jury duty online. Next slide, please. And so, as I just mentioned, we are still collecting data. We are using both electronic surveys and paper surveys. But I think it's important to highlight, because of some of those points I mentioned, because of the option not to answer and things like that, we are only getting those who are responding to their summons online and then also opting into the survey. And I just really feel it's important to highlight that. So that does leave out some individuals. So for instance, those who did not receive their summons in the mail for whatever reason, those who ignored their summons, those who declined to participate in the survey, or those who even, received it, but then chose to respond through a different modality, like over the phone or over the mail, postal mail, or even in person. Next slide, please. And so before I hand it over to Dr. Collins to walk you through some of the results, we have structured the interim report and the rest of the presentation today in these two different sections. So section 1 are 4 courts that were onboarded early in the process. They are from large areas, and so we were able to get enough data to present findings at this point. And so those 4 courts are Clark, King, Pierce, and Spokane County Superior Courts. And as Dr. Collins will mention, for like the race and ethnicity questions, we rely on U.S. Census data, specifically what we call CVAP data, Citizen Voting Age Population data. And so those are going to be, that's going to be used to help create that comparison. And then the second section of the report deals specifically with Pierce County. As Judge Rosen indicated, Pierce County has a very unique capability. I would go far as to say that they're magical, but they have the ability to collect data at multiple points in the process, so specifically from summons to seating. And that really provides us with a different layer and a different depth of data. And it's really honestly quite impressive. So next slide, and I will pass the baton over now to Dr. Collins.
right, I think it's all set up right. Sorry, there are a few last minute changes. I just wanted to drop in sort of a footnote to Professor Gialopsos's statements there. There was a concern raised that is very valid that we can't impact staff in courts. We cannot ask staff that are already overburdened to do a lot more than they already are. And this electronic process was designed so that there's almost no resources from the court used. Once it's set up, it probably takes about 5 hours of time, staff time, emailing back and forth, getting the right electronic stuff set up. The survey just runs in the background. So for example, in King County, we've been running it for a year, maybe even a little more than a year. And we have our jury administrator here. Do we get very many problems from that? And how many calls a month do you think you get about that? Not very many, for those of you who can't hear. We do get some calls and we do get reports of those. People say, well, why am I asked to take this? But the reports are that it is an incredibly small number of people who have issues. So this is running in the background. Jurors are taking it or choosing not to take it. And the burden on the juror is roughly 4 minutes of their time. It's not a very big deal. And that's why we think it's been so successful. The counties that have implemented it have left it running because it doesn't cost them almost anything. And the jurors, we have very, very high response rates because it's not very hard to do. And we've got it set up so that it's very seamless for them. And so we have great data and we want more people to participate. So if you're from a jurisdiction that wants to participate, contact us. And now I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Collins, who's going to take over and walk you through the data.
Hey, everybody. I'm Dr. Collins. I'm a professor in the Criminal Justice Department at CLE University. And I'm going to be throwing a bunch of numbers and tables and things at you. If you have any questions, I'm sure someone will pause me and we can address those. Otherwise, everything that I'm presenting to you today is in the interim report, so you can review it there as well, and we'll have a link to that report in chat shortly. So each of the courts that participated or have been participating have a different begin and interim end date. This table just shows you the number of days that we were drawing data down for the interim report, and you can see the total end there in the far right column. Notably, this is over a 9-month or so period. The 2016-17 study was 14 months, 33 counties, and we had 65,000 surveys. Here we've got 122,000 from just 4 counties. So we're doing much better, and that number is much larger today as we're continuing to gather data. King County is over 200,000. So we're doing, from a methodological standpoint, much better than we had before. So I'm pretty excited about that. And that just shows like we went through a lot of different iterations of the survey, really trying to do better at measurement, really trying to do better at seamless integration and make it easy for people to respond. So in this first section, and I'm going to be talking about basically in 2 sections here. The first section is all 4 really of the courts that are included at the top level at the top of the funnel is kind of how we talk about it. And so I'll be presenting that information to you first, and then we'll go into the deeper dive into Pierce County. But for the top of the funnel for race, Black, American Indian, and Alaska Native survey response were underrepresented amongst those reporting to jury summons for the interim report, following similar patterns in the past. And for example, King, Pierce, and Spokane counties, Black respondents were underrepresented by approximately 46% relative to the population. And that relative to the population, again, is compared to CVAP data. Here's the detailed table with ratios. This represents non-Hispanic categories for each county. As you can see, for example, in the row for Black alone, King, Pierce, and Spokane, the data I just showed you that the average between those and the difference about 46%, no inverse there. But so under 1 is underrepresented, over 1 is overrepresented. Another thing I think in this table that I would bring to your attention is the rows, for example, Black or African American and white, and the remainder of 2 or more race responses. And you may ask yourself, why are those so large? Well, first off, mixed race categories is the largest growing demographic category in the nation. And this has been well documented by the census and other researchers for many years now. And it's similar to what we're experiencing in the state of Washington. In fact, the last 10 years, we've grown by 1 million people in the state of Washington. I don't know if everyone knows that, but it's quite a significant number. However, that said, if we took all of the raw data in those categories and, for example, put them into Black alone, that still wouldn't be enough to flip the sign, so to speak, for the ratio for Black alone in King County. We ran those numbers, and what that means is if we combined everyone into that and just assumed, even though they're not, obviously not all in Black alone, but if we assume that they all were, it still would be underrepresented. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Specifically, when you're talking about underrepresented or in what? At what stage of the process?
At the top, at the response. Okay, yeah. So the question was, at what stage in the process are we talking? And here, this is at summons reporting for service through the online portal. So yeah, good question. Thank you. Hope, does that clear it up for you? Okay.
So all of this data for everybody other than Pierce County is only some. Pierce County data will get into beyond some.
It's a limitation that we have, and that is, I think, really food for thought for as we move forward as a system, trying to decide how do we want to design juror management systems that can drill down further if that's something that is so desired. And I would advocate for that, obviously, better data, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. We move this table up so we could provide some of this information too. Although, as Dr. Gialopsos was mentioning, we collected in the 2017 study, the first big study, at when people were showing up to the courtroom, because there were paper surveys then. So there's a little bit of a difference in that point of contact, but these are comparisons between that early survey and the current survey, and a lot of the patterns are similar. In fact, it's the same ratio for King County, which was fascinating to see. Again, a lot of numbers, but if anyone has any questions, and we're monitoring chat as well, so I'll get interrupted if anyone wants to jump in. Okay. So on average, jurors reporting for jury service have annual household incomes, and that's combined annual household incomes above the median in their respective counties. Jurors reporting for jury service hold higher levels of education on average than the general populations within their respective counties. And we wanted to drill down a little bit further from those, because that may not be surprising to some as you think about it, the system critically maybe. But the way that we began talking about it in our work group was through race, gender and income, social economic status truly. And so we came up with this RGI, is what we refer to it as, race, gender, and income intersection. So we wanted to really key in on those intersections and see what was happening. And for all counties, as income categories increase from lowest to highest, the proportion of white survey respondents increases. Show you what that looks like graphically. So the bars are they're shaded for the darker shade is man and for gender and woman. We do not include additional gender categories as the ends for those get too small as we go up, and but some of that is provided in the actual interim report.
So what's an end?
The frequency of responses. Sorry, for those who don't know. And so the categories get a little bit too small when we start breaking them down. But for man and woman, we see, so we can compare the differences in reporting within each of the income categories. For the lowest income category, reported 0 to about 50,000. You can see there's a little bit difference between men and women in reporting. And then we have the numbers at the top, and the numbers at the top of each column represent the ratio white to non-white. And so higher to, as we approach 100, that's approaching balance, basically, in response to the question. It has nothing to do with CVAP. It just has to do with the number of people reporting in that income category. So we have a higher degree of, similarity across race at the lowest income category. As we go up income categories, that ratio shrinks. So that's what we're talking about when we say what it basically is a classifier, and it's the pattern is pretty clear to me. It's negative. As we go up income categories, the ratio decreases, so it becomes more white as we go up in income category. Any questions on that? I know it's a little bit more difficult to wrap your head around a little bit, but hopefully. Okay, moving on. So we also examined barriers. Once again, a majority of survey respondents, 64% on average across the 3 counties that are reporting on the barrier question, indicated experiencing a conflict or hardship that worked as a barrier to participating in jury service. And once again, work and dependent care related conflicts or hardships were most commonly selected categories. And we found also that women were substantially more likely to report dependent care barriers with respect to children, aging family members, and other dependent care needs. Not surprising. Here's a breakdown of those percentages of reporting within those categories. And you can see Clark, King, and Pierce were the counties that of the 4 had the barriers question. Spokane elected not to have it. So you can see, dependent care, conflict or hardship, and work-related conflict or hardship represent a large proportion of those, responding. You might also notice the other conflict or hardship and multiple conflict or hardship categories selected are quite large as well. What that is just people really like to provide additional information, and for what I think it's a natural human response to do that. And so they would select, I have work-related issues, right? And then they would add detail. And so that would become a multi-response, and the detail may be, I own my own business and I can't possibly take the time. Oh, I've got 2 employees, or I'm, or 1, or just myself, and I can't afford it. Or I'm taking care of my elderly mother who is, needs 24/7 care and is maybe close to hospice or something like that. So some of them get quite detailed. Others, are just what you'd expect, where I'm in the military and I'm overseas, or I'm a college student and I'm studying abroad, etc. And so it's just, it follows the same patterns, I guess is what I'm trying to say, of everything that we're already seeing in those categories above that, with work-related, financial, dependent, transportation, and disability, mental health, and whatnot. So overall, the trends in racial representation are similar when comparing prior survey efforts in Washington State. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the multi-race categories continue to grow nationally and locally, and this trend is well documented. And I mentioned again, just reiterating, while mixed race and two or more race categories are overrepresented in the data, it does not account for the underrepresentation observed in the single race categories. Some may be asking, what effect did remote video conferencing have on anything? We didn't look at that specifically. Therefore, we're at this time unable to determine whether that implementation of remote juror participation during the pandemic had, any measurable effect on juror demographics. Moving on. So section 2 will be I'll be talking a little bit more about Pierce County specifically. And I also wanted to add, once again, and thank Chris Gaddis and Pierce County for being such a great example. And, the data that we have for Pierce County really is significant. And, you'll see that here. But we're able, what makes Pierce County different is we're able to track people through the process from summons to selection. And we can see, they'll take the survey at the beginning, just like everyone else, but we can see how they move through that selection process. So we refer to these in this, well, I refer to this in this presentation as in stages, stage 1 through 4. Stage 1 is online check-in, and that is where they're taking the survey. Stage 2 is report, when people come in and report in person to the courthouse, they check in, we're able to flag that and do a measure there and see what's going on. The next stage is voir dire and the jury selection process. And then the final stage that we take a look at is those who are assigned to a case or sworn as a sworn or alternate juror. So the main kind of answer to the main question that we have for Pierce County was that Black survey respondents are underrepresented at every stage. However, we did find that Black jurors were more represented at stage 4 than at stage 1. So there was a bit of correction in the system as people were moving forward. That was a similar pattern that was found in another recent report out of Minnesota. And it was kind of surprising to see. And I think we'll need to dig in a little bit more to find out what's really going on there, but it's a pattern nonetheless. Another thing that we did for Pierce County, and another reason why they're really stand out for us, is that they were nice enough to allow us to put in an experimental race question. So we asked the normal race question that all the other surveys get, and we added another one, and ethnicity too, by the way. And the second one was asked the respondents to report how they feel other people view them, what category other people view them as. And we found a significant difference between the people who reported in one category at the beginning and a different category in the second question. And that movement, generally speaking, goes to white, more white. So more diverse at the first question and less so or more white in the second. And that was a lot of the mixed race categories. And for example, if someone put Asian and white in the first one, that's how they identify. But in the second one, they say or believe that other people view them as white. So interesting, very interesting. We've got more work to do on this particular question, but I think it is interesting. So considering our RGI key intersections for Pierce County, we found similar patterns, and this is repeated from the top of the funnel as well, but we can kind of dig in a little bit more with Pierce County. But as income categories increase from lowest to highest, the proportion of white survey respondents also increases. We were, however, to find an additional pattern I think is really important to state, that at stage 1, women were overrepresented, but at stage 4, men were overrepresented. And it's basically a flip-flop. And I'll show you that right here. If you there's a lot of numbers once again, but if you key in on man and woman, you can see man at stage 1 is 45.2 and woman is 53.1. And if you skip down or go down to the far right column under stage 4, you can see man becomes 53.6% while woman decreases to 45.3. So why is that? Well, we mentioned earlier, and I think Brooke mentioned this earlier, part of that is the burden of dependent care. And we saw that in particular in Pierce County with looking at excusals and reasons for excusals and matching that up with the barriers question. And for the dependent care barrier answer, 75% were women responding to that in the excusal proportion of folks. So a significant number. In total, 72.5% of survey respondents reported experience at least one conflict or hardship that worked as a barrier to participating in jury service. There was a high degree of similarity across all racial and gender categories regarding reporting a work-related conflict or hardship. And women across all racial groups reported much higher levels of dependent care conflict and hardships. So moving forward, we have some policy recommendations, and I'll probably invite Judge Rosen up to speak to some of these as well, and any of our other team members to talk about what's going on now. If anyone wants to come up and talk about these, but I'll just run through them briefly, and then we'll take questions to the group. But we hope to continue monitoring juror demographics. What we've learned from years ago till now is we've made massive strides, in my opinion, in data collection and monitoring and integration, and we've learned a lot along the way. And we hope that we can continue to study the demographics. People who do not respond to summons, that's, if many of you probably sitting here and thinking, what about everyone who doesn't respond to jury summonses? Because we're just capturing those who do. And then of those people who do, just those who elect to take the survey. So what about everyone else that gets a summons in the mail and doesn't respond, or it goes to the wrong address, or all these other things? This is really important, and I think if we can get to that, we can really start to understand what's going on, especially when we look at disproportionality. Other policy recommendations that we have is to pilot increases in juror pay and monitor changes in demographics to see, what if juror pay impacts people's ability to participate. We know it's a barrier. We know that work-related and financial hardships and travel and transportation and childcare matter. So would increasing $10 a day to some other more meaningful amount impact anything? Well, if we continue collecting data, we'll be able to see that hopefully in the data. And fund data gathering on jury selection from summons to seating in multiple large jurisdictions. What Pierce County has the ability to do is phenomenal. If we can replicate that in other counties and have some other point of information to start, really painting a picture of what's going on, we'll be able to make better decisions, in my opinion. Frank, you want to come up and talk about Senate bill? So I'm going to pass the mic over to Frank Thomas, Administrative Office of Courts.
All right. Thank you, Pete. Hi, everyone. I'm Frank Thomas. I coordinate the Washington State Minority and Justice Commission on behalf of the state Supreme Court. After all the information that you've heard today, you might be asking yourself, what comes next? And maybe if you're my type of person, what can we do to support it moving forward? And really, the biggest push right now is happening in the legislature with Substitute Senate Bill 5128 concerning jury diversity. There are significant proposals, a multitude of proposals in this bill, some of which are related to the work of continuing to gather this crucial information and research jury composition in our state, and others that seek to make meaningful interventions right away that we believe, as a result of our research, will improve jury diversity across the state. 5128 has 4 proposals in particular. The first would make permanent the voluntary jury summons demography survey that we've outlined for you today. In addition to that, it would open up an avenue to making this a practice at the administrative office of the courts, thus creating an institutional buy-in on the jury diversity research and measurement process. Secondly, the bill would establish a child care work group, and that's specifically because of some of the data that Dr. Collins outlined showing the particular barriers to jury service that women face as a result of their disproportionate caregiver responsibilities. Third, and probably most notably, certainly most expensively, there is talk of an increase in juror pay around the state. There are different proposals being deliberated by the legislature right now, but ultimately the goal is to significantly increase the statutorily mandated $10 to $25 juror pay range that there is at present. That $10 number, the number that most courts default to in the state of Washington, was enacted about 5 decades ago. And lastly, there would be a clause for optional email summonsing. So courts would have, after this bill, the opportunity to summons via email instead of just snail mail. We think that email addresses are more sticky than physical mailing addresses these days, meaning you're likely to keep your email address for longer, and it makes it a more reliable contact source. And you would also have the option with the Secretary of State to opt into that process yourself. So 4 tremendous proposals within this bill package that would really continue to advance the research and understanding of jury composition in the state, but more importantly, start to take initiative to improve representativeness on our juries. Now, the bill is moving very quickly through the legislature. We're very grateful to have the support of many judicial associations and institutional partners. Association and more supporting this bill. And it's your next opportunity, if you're interested to support this bill, is on Tuesday in the Senate Ways and Means Committee, where we'll have a public hearing at 4 p.m. We encourage everyone in attendance today to push their organizations to sign in support of the bill and provide comment where appropriate. But ultimately, we're confident that some measure of a jury package will be passed out of the legislature, as it was so graciously passed by Representatives Berquist and Hackney last year, that will allow our Seattle U research team, along with the Administrative Office of the courts, to continue this work. Thanks, guys. Pete, Judge Rosen. Thank you.
So that concludes the formal part of the presentation, but if there's any questions that we can answer, happy to take them. Yeah.
We've been collecting data and
So for those of you who couldn't hear, the question from Judge Sutton is, hey, we have some of this data that's been collected because of pandemic-related changes in King County. Can we use that to get what we are calling, what's the gold standard in Pierce County? And the answer is, we don't know. Have we thought about it? Absolutely. That data resides with 53, now 54 different courtrooms. There are juror privacy issues. We didn't discuss it here, but this bill was drafted. We drafted it originally to take into account juror anonymity as its first and foremost thing. We have to protect juror anonymity by law. And so the data that exists in, probably at this point, thousands of spreadsheets, essentially, in different spots around King County, could certainly be looked at. It should be looked at, but it's not as simple as saying we'll do it. One, it's going to take a lot of resources because all that data has to be merged together and analyzed. And second, no one has addressed the privacy issues. And by court rule, nobody but the judge who's assigned to the case can look at that data without getting a court order allowing it. So there might be some ways around it. And am I in favor of doing it personally? Just me personally? Yes. But it's not as simple as this solution where the jurors are filling out at the front end. But it would provide more information. Not all of the same information though, because we don't collect in those spreadsheets who was seated and who was not seated, at least not in the same spreadsheet. So then again, that adds another data layer. So long answer, we've thought about it. It's a good idea. Will it happen or when will it happen? I don't know. And it looks like we have some questions in the chat. We want the email addresses I'm hearing from somebody. Let's see. Here you go. There are your email addresses for your questions. Any other questions? Anybody want to know anything about diversity? So I'll start with that, and then we'll hear from Professor Collins. There are certainly some who do. It varies by question. So the question, so everyone on Zoom can hear, is, do jurors not answer all of the questions that are asked in the demographic survey, and how many? It varies by question. So people were less likely to answer the income question than some of the other questions. But as I stated earlier, but across the board, we got answers to about 85% of the lowest answered questions and about 95% to the highest answered questions. Anything to add to that?
No, the only other thing would be,
Come on up to the mic.
yeah, the only other part of that question would be those declining to enter it. And so there's multiple points of analysis there. So there's a lot of duplicate. When we get the raw data, there's a lot of duplicates, because if you start on your phone and then complete it on your computer or something like that, or start on your phone, put your phone away and then bring it back out again, it'll duplicate it. And so we had to go through all of those and clean that up. But then those who just decline to answer and go forward, it is a number of them. We do monitor the total number of people coming in or responding or contacting the court in Pierce County and then coming into the courthouse. And do you remember what the percentage? I'm looking at Chris Gaddis. Do you remember what the percentage of those, the totals were? Yeah. Yeah, so about 50%, but there's another caveat to that. Not everyone responds to their summons through the electronic means. A lot show up in person, and some other folks mail it in. And so we've got a good representation amongst those who are going into the electronic reporting part of it. We can certainly do better. And try to get even more at all of those other points of contact. But yeah, hopefully did that answer your question?
So, yeah, and I wanted to add a couple things to it. So different jurisdictions have different practices or policies or even just realities. Like Pierce County has about 50% of people who don't register online. This question came from our jury administrator, but in King County, that number is much, much smaller. We have most people registering online. In other counties, it could be much higher, or other jurisdictions. But first, and I can't speak to this exactly, I can just repeat what I've heard from Professor Collins a number of times. This data that we have is so robust that it's accurate to, the odds of being accurate was something like 99.99% or something like that. So that's one piece of information that statistically, with things I don't understand, data analysis, they can say this has almost a certainty of being roughly accurate. But we can also look beyond that. We did the study in 2016 to 2017 in paper. We did the study in 2021, which had some problems, didn't have a lot of responses, but there still were over 3,000 responses. And now we have this one with over 100,000 responses, well over 100,000 responses. They all show almost the same thing. So it's I don't want to say it's my belief because that's not strong enough. It is my firmly held belief that I think is very, very evident in the data over years that we're getting the same result no matter what we do. And it doesn't matter which group we're looking at. If it's people who fill things out in paper, who are in the courthouse, people who do it electronically on their phones or their computers from home, or people who are seated on juries, we still find that through the process, the data is the same. And that leads me to the indisputable conclusion that the data is accurate. Even though some counties have more people coming in person and some counties have less and other things are going on, roughly 50% of the African-American population is reporting for jury duty. We found that in every single study. It's just too obvious to miss. So I think that that is something that's worth noting. We just have data that shows what it shows, and I don't think there's any way around it. We've been pushing on this for a long time to say, is this accurate? Is it not accurate? Why isn't it accurate? What do we need to do next? At some point, we just say, wow, this really is probably roughly accurate. We have a question in the chat. The question is from Ms. Gordon. Can we make this data available so that users can filter it by the demographics of choice? This is what I was talking about at the beginning of my first presentation. So the answer is we don't know if we're going to be able to make it publicly available or exactly what will be available to make publicly available. Part of the answer to the question is we want to do that. So it's definitely on our radar screen. But another piece of that puzzle is juror anonymity. We have to make sure that whatever we publish cannot be tied to a specific trial or a specific jury panel or a specific juror. The example that I always use is I used to be a judge in Black Diamond, where we had one trial every other year. So if you were to look at data from that trial on a website, you would have a very high chance of being able to tie answers to a specific juror because there's only one set of jurors and there was only about 12, 15 of them once every other year. Those sorts of questions have to be answered by law. The law that allowed us to do this, it said we have to preserve juror anonymity. And so, yes, we want it public. We want you to be able to sort it when you're in trial. It's not currently available. And when we know more, we're happy to tell you where it is if we're able to do it. But as of right now, it's not publicly available. In fact, it resides in such a way that I can't access it as a public servant. I don't have access to data that's publicly identifiable. It all resides outside of the government. So it's not subject to public records. Of course, the conclusions are, we've already published those. But I understand why you're asking the question and we want to make it public. And Linda Ridge is asking, did we look at work? I'm going to ask Professor Collins come up and answer this. Did we look at people who said they were having work-related conflicts compared to their income? There may be physicians, attorneys, and others in higher income brackets who cite these conflicts as well as those who are low income brackets. It's funny you say that. ask this question because we've been through this a number of times. I'm going to let Professor Collins talk about the statistics. But one little thing we saw in the data that we weren't expecting is that we started to see people complain about work-related conflicts at a very slightly, maybe not statistically significant, but a slightly higher rate when they got to really high incomes, which is your surgeon question, who makes, I don't know what surgeons make, $500,000, $1 million a year. We saw a little uptick in those people saying, I can't miss my work. And so I want to be excused for that. But I'll let Professor.
Yeah, I would just add to that is correct. That's what we were seeing. We did look, and we'll probably look or provide some more detailed information on that in the final report. But I also want to add to another observation or a bit of information that I think is really important to convey to folks is just because people are reporting a conflict or hardship does not mean that they were that they didn't continue on through the process and that or that they weren't selected for jury service or to be impaneled on jury.
Although we could tell some of that in Pierce County because we had much better data. So there's lots of interesting data. Kim Gordon asked that question I answered about, is this going to be publicly available? One of the things that we were looking at in the data relates to one of my earlier slides about people who are of a specific racial or ethnic category being excused because of not speaking English and being disqualified by law. That's something that we did briefly look at in one jurisdiction and found some evidence to support. And there are so many questions like that that we haven't analyzed that we think you should be able to analyze. That is the reason we want this data to become public. We just have to find a way to make it safely public. Keep typing your questions. I did want to go back, if I can get this to work, to this slide 13. If I can get there. No, go ahead. Yeah. Well, let me do this first. I just want to come to the correct slide here. This slide, and I think I can do it with my mouse. This line here on Black alone, this is a ratio of what was expected for people who are Black alone, getting much, we are getting about 50% of people who identify as fully African American reporting to jury service. This is a reporting, this is not the Pierce County. Or this is almost the same number. I think in one of the, in the 2016 study for King County here, this number 56, it was 52. It's just a very stable number. And I want to reiterate something that Professor Collins already said down here with the data, with the 2 or more race categories, or for example, Black and African American and Black or white. This line, these numbers, if you look at the actual numbers behind them, you're seeing percentages and ratios here. But if you combine those with the numbers for Black alone, of course, these numbers move. Somebody who answered that they're Black and white, they will, some of them will be perceived as Black and perceive themselves as Black, but won't be included in this 56% number. But if you look at the data behind it, if you put all of those categories together, we're not even anywhere close to having enough people who identify as African American plus African American and something else being on our juries, as there should be. And that's a question that we've got from some interested legislators and others before. No matter how we dice and slice this, it shows there's a problem. The numbers can change a little bit, but there is a problem in jury representation. Go ahead.
I was just going to mention this. I think we mentioned this maybe in the text in the report, but we also dug into peremptories in Pierce County, and we did not find evidence of racial disproportionality in the peremptory challenges. So I just wanted to mention that.
Professor, remind me, if I remember correctly, the numbers that we were looking at to get to that conclusion were very small and gave you some pause. Not that it is inaccurate, but that we would need to have much more data to make that as a full conclusion. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's one of the problems. Professor Collins referred to the N. Well, N is the number of people who are doing something. So the N for this chart that you're looking at, the number of people in King County who filled out this survey are, I forget, it's about 70,000. It's a huge number and you can draw great statistical significance from it. But the number of people who identify as American Indian who were given a peremptory in Pierce County is very small, just because a lot of people are weeded out through the process for hardship, or they don't respond to their summons, and there's not that many of those in the community. And so that brings up the question, why aren't other courts gathering data like Pierce County does? And should that be one of the things that we are focusing on as the state court system? Should King County be able to tell you how many Asian American women were struck for cause or for peremptory, or Black men or gay men, or whatever the category is, Hispanic? We can't do that, to our knowledge, in any place except in Pierce County. And so should we be devising new systems to do that? Should we be talking to the juror management companies? There are companies that provide software to almost every court in Washington. I haven't counted, it was in about 8 years, but I did have conversations with those companies that there, to our knowledge at the time, every jurisdiction in Washington was using an outside software company except one, plus Pierce County, so 2. And why aren't they including this ability to gather data in their process? And should we be licensing it? Should we be telling them, if you want our business, then you need to include this? Should we be licensing Pierce County software? But instead of having in that end chart, there were 2 people who were stricken, whether peremptory or for cause in Pierce County, who were American Indian. We want that number to be so much bigger that we know that it's accurate. So that's something I think we need to consider as a system. We have some other questions here. Do you know if the demographics on hardship are meaningfully different for shorter trials than lengthy trials? I don't know if you do. Yeah, I agree. It's a great question, and we don't know that. We did not study it at all. So this is why the data needs to become public, so you can ask those great questions and get them answered. Yeah, and Chris Gaddis is saying they don't have that data at all. We might be able to create data even all electronically, but again, it's just one piece of thousands that we want to look at. Any other questions? Well, if you have them, ask them. Otherwise, we're going to say thank you for your time. We hope that you will all do the following. Go into the Washington State legislatures, and I'll go right to the slide. Go to the legislator's website, which is just leg.wa.gov, and put in the bill number 5128. And you can register your support right there. You can register to speak at the hearing, or you can just register and say, I support this, and this is why. I work as an attorney. I've been doing this for 20 years, and this is what I've seen in the courtroom, and this is why I think this legislation is important. And of course, you can feel free to oppose it or make suggestions to improve it. But it'll take each of you 2 minutes to do that. And I think it would be very powerful for the legislature to start hearing from people who are involved in the justice system by either showing up, which you can do on Zoom, or just typing your comments in right to the website. So thank you all for your time and your attention. Thank you to the Minority and Justice Commission, to Cynthia, Frank, Pierce County, Seattle U, professors involved, and everybody else. And I have to say a special thank you to Justice Yu, who has been an ardent supporter of this for 10 years and has really made things happen. We appreciate all of your interest in it. And if you have questions, send us an email, and have a great day.